So this is class number 12 on the Golden Doves. We're at page 15, Roman numeral 15 in the introduction. And I just want to review quickly what we read in the previous class because there was a point I wanted to review. So we said that rabbinic authority comprises three fundamental institutions. There's a transmission of the Torah. That's an institution. That's important. What do I mean to say it's an institution? It's a national institution. Not everybody can transmit the Torah. Let's say I was to claim that I have a special masoret from my father and his further ancestors all the way up. We have a special tradition. But like some rabbis make this claim, incidentally. So, for example, I have a special tradition that Ukshartam leot al yadecha really means that you have to have a letter on your hand. Is there any credence to that claim? Do we take such a claim seriously? And let's say that somebody actually verified that, yes, he has an ancient tradition, right? That a pasuk in the Torah means such and such, other than, of course, the tradition of the Hakamim. But somebody says, no, I have an ancient tradition that this is the case. Why don't we give it credence? Because rabbinic authority is based upon institutions, and the transmission of the Torah is not something that is entrusted to individuals qua individuals. Rather, it is those individuals that were entrusted by the nation as the transmitters of the traditions of the nation, meaning the Hakamim. Moshe Rabbeinu was Rasul Allah. He was a messenger of God, but he was also entrusted and appointed by the Jewish people as their representative. So he was entrusted by the nation to receive the Torah. And Joshua, his Talmid, was accepted by the nation as their leader, and he was entrusted as the Talmid of Moshe Rabbeinu to receive the Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's not that an individual could say, oh, I have an ancient tradition. That may very well be the case. But it has no bearing upon Jewish law, or Jewish tradition, because Jewish tradition is a function of the national institution. And that's why Rambam always says, Moshe betino, Yoshua betino, Shemuel betino, David betino, the national court of the Jewish people. It's a national institution. That's the first thing I wanted to emphasize, that it's so important. So we don't care if you or your family or me or my family has an ancient tradition that such and such is the halakha. It's irrelevant. Unless it was part of the Jewish national court. Oh, then that's different, but that's why we have the Gemara. Number 2, there is derasha. So we have the Mesira. We have the Mesira of the Torah. Moshe kibel Torah Musaraha li Yoshua. The Mesira. Okay, the transmission. Number 2, derasha, interpretation of the scripture. I now want to interpret a pasuk. I want to interpret that the pasuk V'haya machanecha kadosh in Perashat Kitesem means that you have to have a mechisayin knis. Meaning the law of mechisayin knis is a deoraita law. What's wrong with that? I can make a beautiful derasha. And of course we have mechisayin knis. I mean, that's the minhag of our Batei Knesset. Nobody's questioning that. My question is not whether we should or shouldn't have mechisot and knis. And my question is whether somebody can make a derasha like that. Hence transforming the law of mechisa into a din deoraita. That's the question. I want to make a law deoraita. There should be a mechisayin knis. Can I do that? Well, I can do that, but does that have any credence? Do other people have to follow that derasha? And the answer is no. Why? Because the derasha on Pesukim, Midrash Halacha, is a national institution. It's up to the Jewish court to make those derashot, and the Jewish court is part of one of the branches of the Jewish government, right? So I can make the most beautiful derashah in the world, but it's irrelevant. I'm an individual. If I could become a member of the Bet Din, inshallah, I should, be'anava, b'chfifat rosh. If I would have the zechut and there was a sunny dream, then I can suggest the derashah. But until then, I would have to wait patiently, and I can make all the derashot in the world. The only thing is they don't have any credence. And the third institution is hora'ah, judicial application of the Torah and the promulgation of new legislation. So I want to right, that's interesting. What's the difference between 2, derasha, interpretation of scriptures, and 3, hora'ah, judicial application of the Torah and the promulgation of new legislation? And I think what I said for the last 5 minutes was actually the third one. So I want to make new laws for Ayam Hanecha Kadosh. I want to make a new law on Ayam Hanecha Kadosh. That's the promulgation of new legislation. The derasha, interpretation of the scriptures, is, for example, we know that Peri Eis Hadar is an etrog. We know that because we have a Kabbalah mi Moshe mi Sinai. So we know it's an etrog. But I now want to make a derasha in the pasuk showing that it's an etrog, that Peri Eis Hadar is etrog. That derasha is irrelevant because it's a national institution that can make those types of derashot. So the Gemara makes a derasha. It says Peri Hadar Ba'ilan Mishana Lishana. That's one of the derashot of the Gemara. The other was Peri Hadar Al Kol Mayim. And then there was a third one. Shetam Esof Yoshavim. So those are derashot. Those derashot can be made by the Bet Din of the Jewish people. The Bet Din has the right to make derashot on Pesukim, right? So that was the second one. The third one, judicial application of the Torah and the promulgation of legislation, that has to do with the famous dinim mufla'im, right? And that's what I was describing, namely, I have a pasuk ve'ema hanecha kadosh, and I want to say that pasuk means mehisa in knis. You can't do that. The Bet Din can do that. You cannot do that. So that's hora'ah, judicial application of the Torah and the promulgation of new legislation. And then there's also gezerot, tekanot. I want to make new gezerot on the Jewish people. I want to make new tekanot on the Jewish people that only the Bet Din can do. So I wanted to explain that. Now I want to go to the last, Roman numeral 16. Go to the first full paragraph, and this is what I want to study. And with that, we will finish this section of the introduction. Wissenschaft des Judentum and much of subsequent Jewish scholarship are concerned with the origin and evolution of Judaism, that is, its diachronic axis. So the scientific study of Judaism and the study of Judaism in the university world, especially in Berlin, but it continues, of course, through to today, is looking at Judaism at the diachronic axis, right? Meaning the development of Judaism, right? And the quote-unquote evolution of Judaism at the historical plane, right? The diachronic axis. Much of the reproof of rabbinic institutions and literature, as well as the traditional Jewish commentaries, stem precisely from the inability of the modern investigator to distinguish between his own diachronic axis and the synchronic axis of the rabbis. And this is important, right? I'll give you an example. I always return to the same example. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho. The Chachamim say Zochrehu al hayayin. So the scholars will say, ha 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 ha. In the days of Moses in the desert, there was no wine. How could they have possibly said that Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho means Zochrehu al hayayin? That just doesn't make sense historically. How could they have possibly done Kiddush in the desert? And the answer is really simple. When the Chachamim say Zochreu al hayayin, they were not making a historical statement. They were legislating the law of Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho at the synchronic access. Meaning, in the days of the Chachamim, when they legislated this law, in their days, you memorialized a great event, or you recognized a great event through a toast on wine, similar to what we do today. I want to make now a toast to the bride and groom, right? So till today we have that attitude. So Zochreu al hayayin is at the synchronic level, right? But they ask a question: how could they say Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho means wine? Because that's precisely the point of the derashot of the Chachamim. The derashot of the Chachamim look at the Pesukim and they give it a meaning which fits the contemporary approach to the matter. And the current approach to remembering something important. How do you remember? You don't just remember it mentally, but you take a cup of wine, expensive wine, you gather people around, and you make the declaration, and everybody says l'chaim, and they drink, right? So that's the point of how the academicians and the scientific study of Judaism, they just totally clueless. I mean, they don't understand what they're doing. The diachronic axis is essential to understanding the context and circumstances of rabbinic institutions and literature. And as my father says, it's not that the diachronic axis is not important. Of course it's important. You want to understand the history. You want to understand the historical context of Chachmei HaGemara. You want to understand the historical context of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. Why was Rabbeinu HaKadosh so successful? He was successful. Well, if you study the history of the period, you understand there was tremendous. It was a period of respite for the Jewish people in Judea, and there was an abundance. And in the context of that abundance, they were able to work on this great project called the Mishnah. Right? So of course the diachronic axis is important. But it's equally important not to confuse the diachronic study with the synchronic study. Those are two separate axes, as Ferdinand de Saussure says, right? So the diachronic axis is essential to understanding the context and circumstances of rabbinic institutions and literature. Of course, you want to understand the literature of the Gemara. What do the words mean? Well, you have to understand those words back then. How were those words used back then? So yeah, you're going to look at the diachronic axis. Again, nobody's saying not to use a diachronic axis. We're just saying not to confuse the two, right? Right? So the diachronic axis is essential, as we said, to studying the rabbinic institution. It is about Judaism, right? So we study the diachronic axis, we're studying about Judaism. Who was the Pharaoh in the historical time of Yetziat Mitzrayim? And Bilia ben Ozeg has a beautiful analysis of that subject in Sefer Shemot. That's a diachronic axis. That's looking at things from a historical perspective. It is important, of course. You want to know who the Pharaoh was. You understand who the Pharaoh was. You understand why this Pharaoh was against the Jewish people, because the Jewish people were allied with the previous Pharaoh, who was from apparently a different ethnic group. Right? So you see, history is important. Of course it's important. But that's about Judaism. That's a study about Judaism, right? What is the context? What is the background? What is the language? How do they dress? What did they eat? All important to understanding about Judaism. But it's not Judaism. Judaism is a living system. Judaism is the here and now. We're alive. We don't live in a museum. Our synagogues are not museums. Living people go to the synagogue and pray and say nishmat and pray before Hashem and put on tefillin. That's a synchronic axis. Don't confuse the two. The synchronic axis involves understanding the factors giving cohesion to the system of values of the rabbis, right? So everything exists contemporaneously. All the Pesukim exist contemporaneously. Each Pasuk has different values, and we have to bring them together. How do we bring these values and these Pesukim together, right? To create a cohesive system. It pertains to Judaism itself, not to its circumstances. So when the Chachamim study the Torah synchronically, and they say, En mukudam muharba Torah, and yes, it would look at the case of Rivka, right, that Rivka should stay with us for a year and use that as a source for a halacha. Today, that's because Judaism is a living system, and the text is alive, and we look at the text as if though it all exists synchronically at one time. As any living system, as the same way the Supreme Court would look at the Constitution, although they rarely do that nowadays, but that's a different story. Why the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't look at the Constitution or doesn't care about the Constitution so much, that's a story for, political science perhaps. But the point is, the Jewish people and the Jewish Hachamim cared about our Constitution, about the Torah, and treated it like it was a living, cohesive system. Both these axes are necessary for a total view of Judaism, and you need this diachronic axis to understand the history, as we already explained. No need to repeat that, but you need the synchronic axis because Judaism is alive, and it exists now, and it existed in the days of the Hachamim, and they viewed it as a living system. And yes, they made derashot that brought the Pesukim up to their days. Right? For example, how do we remember Yetziat Mitzrayim on Leil HaSeder? Because in those days, it was very common for the Greeks to have these long, elaborate meals with different cups of wine, and every cup of wine, there would be a l'chaim, and it would deal with a different subject. That's what the Hachamim did, because they were alive, and it was contemporaneous, and that's the living Judaism. We do it today because we still relate to that. We still understand the idea of having a toast on a cup of wine in different parts of the meal. Although highly sensitive to historical considerations, the major thrust of this study is the synchronic axis of the rabbis. I love it. This book, The Golden Doves, is going to treat the Hachamim like they are a living system, not like they are a relic in a museum. We are going to look at the synchronic axis of Judaism. Not that history isn't important, but there were some great history books. That's been done. But to actually treat Judaism, not like it's a relic in a museum, but it's like a Ais Hayim, and like the Hachamims, the Gemara, the Masoret of Chachmei Andalus, Chachmei Sefarad, it's a living Masoret. That's what this book is going to do. And with this, we have actually concluded the introduction to the introduction. We're going to be continuing the introduction, but the second part of the introduction actually summarizes what the book is about. Until now, it's kind of been an introduction to the book, and then we're going to have a summary of the book in the following passages.